conversations. Let's do a quick show of hands. Who's been to one of our conservation conversations before? Yay, we have some frequent customers. And then I guess we've got a bunch of new faces. So we're really excited to have this series of free lectures here at the St. Louis Zoo to be able to promote, talk about the really amazing conservation work we do both here in St. Louis as well as, out there around the world in the wild. And tonight's lecture is definitely going to be a wonderful example of that. Before I introduce our speaker, I do want to make a special note, and thanks to the Academy of Science of St. Louis, they help us get the word out about this lecture and the lectures like this. And we also host the Science Seminar Series here at the St. Louis Zoo. We actually have a speaker here tomorrow night who will be talking about alternative energy. And you can find out more information about either of these programs on the zoo's website or on the Academy of Sciences website. And you can just Google Academy of Science St. Louis or St. Louis Zoo. You all know how to find the St. Louis Zoo on the web, right? So what I'd like to do now is introduce our speaker, Sharon Deem. Sharon is both new to the zoo and not new to the zoo. She's been an employee here for over 5 years, but her office has been based not here in St. Louis, but in one of my favorite places, the Galapagos Islands. How awful that must have been. I'm sure it was really hard. And Sharon has worked in a number of different zoos around the world. She is, when I go out and talk to colleagues at other zoos, I always hear, oh my gosh, Sharon Deem is working with you guys now. You are just so incredibly lucky, because she really is truly a leader in this emerging field of conservation medicine. It's really where conservation is going for the future. So we're really excited to be able to welcome her, learn more about what she's doing, and help her with this journey. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sharon.
Thanks, Louise. Good evening, everyone. And before I get started on the presentation, I really want to thank all of you for coming to the zoo tonight. I know it's a chilly night, so thanks for getting out of your houses and coming here. And also a really special thanks to the Academy of Science for allowing me a few minutes to talk about my favorite subject, which is conservation medicine. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is really talk about what conservation medicine is, why we, why you, why we should care about it, and how it can help with the survival of species. And I have hopefully about 45 minutes of a presentation, and then I hope it will generate some questions, some discussion that we can all have. And is the volume good for you? Does it work good? Okay. So really what I've done, the presentation I've put together is kind of in 3 parts. And the first 2 are really looking at our world today in the context of conservation challenges and public health issues. And then definitions of really what conservation medicine is, giving some examples. The second part is looking at the role that zoos have in this emerging field of conservation medicine. And then lastly, looking at really the St. Louis Zoo, the past, present, and future, and our role in conservation medicine. And I don't have on this slide, but I'm going to end with a few slides that hopefully will bring it all together for us and maybe be a platform or a jumping off point to generate some questions or discussion. So the first part is really thinking about our world today, and this term for me really gets me thinking about this, and this is the Anthropocene, and many of you may have heard of this term. It's been on the cover of The Economist. It's been in National Geographic this year. It's been talked about quite a bit, but this was actually coined in the year 2000 by a Nobel Prize-winning scientist, Dr. Paul Crutzen. And really what it's saying is that humans, so humans are the drivers of the changes on planet Earth today. So the geologic era, which if you go to your textbooks, you will see we're in the Holocene, but many of us are saying, no, we're really in the Anthropocene. Humans are what are affecting change on planet Earth today. And we can ask, well, why might that be? And another thing that has been in the news a lot this year, as we all know, since we hit the 7 billion point last month, is sort of just the population, the human population has really increased quite dramatically. And there's been great information on this again this year, and it's kind of interesting because there's a lot of debate and discussion about, well, we're very urbanized, so over 50% of us live in cities, so maybe our human footprint isn't as big as it might be should we be spread out. So the urban centers could be a good thing when we think about the human footprint on the planet. But me as a conservationist, you know, I really think about, well, okay, we may be more confined to cities, but what really does it take to feed, shelter, and clothe and care for this many of us? And a figure from a few years ago actually now is that 38% of the land surface is used for the production of food for humans. So although we may be confined in cities, that's a pretty big footprint when we think about the planet, when we think about wildernesses and what it takes to feed this many people. And that's not even thinking about, let's say, protein extraction from the oceans or getting oil exploration in the ocean. So we have to think about sort of the anthropogenic or the human drivers that may be influencing planet Earth at this present time. And there's a lot of great projects right now because of this sort of challenges to humanity. And some of you may be familiar with this. And this is an international think tank called the Millennium Project. And they've been around since 1996. And they publish each year this State of the Future book. And this graph is actually from the 2011 book. And it has the 15 global challenges to humanity. And you can see the 15 nodes there and read what each of them are. And you can see how they're all interconnected. And really understand these are the challenges that our generation, those of us today on Earth, face. But we can also look at these and see how they could have implications for human health and for conservation of species. So sort of another way to look at these nodes is I've put together here kind of a laundry list of some of the challenges that we talk about to conservation. So, you know, the human population we've talked about, habitat modification, pollution, tourism, invasive species or invasive pathogens in new areas. And we can see how all of these really are challenges to conserving wildlife and wild lands. But if you put on sort of your health hat, you can also see that these can have implications for sort of the health status of populations or the expression of diseases in populations, whether they're wildlife that we want to conserve or humans. So kind of thinking about the Millennium Project and the 15 nodes and this laundry list, we can see there's a lot of challenges out there. So that's kind of something that we need to think about to come up with solutions for some of these challenges. And I'm just going to go through a few of them. And it seems like sort of in my conservation world, which you will all enter tonight and go away being a part of, we talk a lot about infectious diseases. But I think it's important to spend just one slide also thinking about non-infectious impacts that we have on human health, ecosystem health, and wildlife. And the Horizon oil spill, I think, brought that to light for many of us. And there's been great studies thinking about the impact that has had on the health of the ecosystem in the Gulf, wildlife, as well as the food chain for humans. But I would say one thing I would like you all to consider is really the less obvious impacts that kind of human-wildlife interface has, the hit-by-car animals we see on the roads in our neighborhoods. And I think this is a really good example. As Louise just said, I spent 3 years in the Galapagos just recently, and a lot of what I did was look at wildlife and kind of helped with rehabilitation of wildlife that had some human impacts. And this is just one example showing this kind of hidden disease risk. And that's an endemic land iguana in Galapagos that I'm treating. And this animal was actually tossed around because of the air turbines of an airplane that was taking off. So kind of those, we don't think about that so much, but there's all these day-to-day sort of possibly negative impacts that we have on populations. So what we call the non-infectious disease problems. But I think what's more in the news, and rightly so, is some of these infectious disease problems that are challenging the conservation of many species. And hopefully a lot of these disease names you recognize. You've heard of them. Chytridiomycosis, or that BD fungus that has caused a lot of decline in different amphibian populations and has actually even led to the extinction of species. White nose syndrome we'll talk a bit about tonight. Fibropapillomatosis, Ebola, all these names are probably familiar to most of you, and they actually have had population level impacts on some pretty important species that we see up there and have even led to the extinction of species. So disease is a challenge for some of the wildlife that we're trying to conserve. But I think one thing that, again, is even maybe more in the media today are what we call zoonotic pathogens. And zoonotic pathogens are those infectious disease agents that are shared between animals and humans. And if you look at the last 2 decades, 75% of the emerging infectious diseases in humans today are shared with animals, so they can go back and forth between animals and humans. And 70% of those are shared from wild animals. And since there's maybe 100 of us here, we could go around this room about 10 times and continue to name all these different diseases. SARS, avian influenza, West Nile virus, monkeypox. I mean, I think you've heard about them in the media lately. So I think there's a lot of diseases there, and there's a lot of emphasis on this today, this sharing of disease pathogens. But for me as the conservationist, I think it's really important that the wildlife don't get labeled as the bad guys. The wildlife really aren't the bad guys. It's what we're talking about, this Anthropocene and the interactions that we have, the changing kind of dynamics that humans and wildlife have today as we move farther into wildernesses, as maybe we trade wildlife more than we used to. The bushmeat trade, which used to be localized in a forest, you can have spread from Central Africa to Kansas City in 24 hours. So we have these interconnectedness. So the wildlife are not the bad guys. I think that's very important for us to remember. I also think it's one of the reasons that this is kind of a hot topic, zoonotic pathogens, is one, because of pandemic potential. You know, avian influenza has been in the news because of that, but also there's a big price tag on many of these zoonotic pathogens, and this graph is a few years out of date, but you know, the SARS epidemic that occurred in the 2000s cost, you know, up to $50 billion. I mean, these have a big price tag on them to control these pathogens in human populations, these zoonotic pathogens. So that's kind of looking at our world today, thinking about some of the conservation challenges as well as public health issues and where the two intersect. And that really brings us up to this exciting emerging approach called conservation medicine. That the term was actually coined in the 1990s, and it's because of this understanding of the interrelatedness of diseases between humans and animals in the context of changing environments and changing ecosystems. So it's an interdisciplinary field that studies this relationship between humans and animals and ecosystem health. So interdisciplinary, it takes all kinds of folks from different professions and with different backgrounds and experience to try to come together to solve some of those challenges I just presented in the previous slides. It's a really exciting emerging field. And I do want to also define one other term you may have heard about called One Health. And that too was coined, I should say recoined, it's kind of been around for hundreds of years, but has kind of come back into the mainstream because of this understanding, this interconnected relationship. And the One Health initiative it aims to merge animal and human health to benefit both. And I think you can see conservation medicine, One Health, they're just terms of approaches to look at sort of the healthcare for conservation needs, for public health, and really, in my opinion, sort of for planetary health. And tonight we're gonna call it conservation medicine. We're the conservationists, so we're gonna put it in kind of the terms of conservation. And I'm gonna give 3 examples, and I think a lot of people, when they see these examples, they kind of get it. They get this relationship. And the first example, I'm gonna take us to the Indian subcontinent. So vultures in India, there's 3 species of vultures that in the last 2 decades have declined by about 90%. So that's a large decline. They're actually on the brink of extinction. And so we can ask, and a lot of studies have kind of looked into this, well, why has there been this decline? And it's kind of interesting. It's actually due to an anti-inflammatory drug called diclofenac, which is used in veterinary medicine for arthritis and for inflammation type maladies or illnesses in animals. And in India, it was used extensively in cattle. As many of us know, cattle are sacred, so they're not slaughtered. So if they're getting arthritis and they're not feeling so well and they're living an extended life, people are giving diclofenac to make them feel good until they die. And what do vultures do? Well, vultures are scavengers, right? And vultures eat carrion. So when the cows die, the vultures do what they do for us. Their ecosystem service is to eat that carrion. So now what happened was this drug, which was a good thing in the cows, actually caused kidney disease or kidney failure in these vulture species and devastated these populations. So the vultures' decline was very huge. But we still have the cattle around, right? So if you now no longer have these vultures giving us the free services, well, who else is going to kind of take over? Feral dogs. And the feral dog population in India has increased significantly because they have all this free food. The groceries are there because the vultures aren't available to be doing what they do for us for free. And what do we think about sometimes as health people with feral dogs? Well, we worry about diseases that they may pass on to people, and in this case, rabies. And the incidence of rabies in people has also gone up. So you can see that really nice connection, that it's all interrelated. And I think that's a really good example of one of these examples of sort of the One Health connection. But I'm going to come kind of closer to home, and many of you are probably familiar with this problem that we're dealing with, white nose syndrome in bats. And this is a fungal infection that humans can't get, but bats, when they get it, they actually die. And you can see the little white fungi on these bats here. And what happens when they're hibernating during the winter, this fungus wakes them up, and then they basically starve to death, because they're in metabolic overload and they can't get the pests, the mosquitoes and such that they eat to survive. And we've lost over 1 million bats in this country since 2006 when this fungus arrived. So a lot of us don't like bats, unfortunately, but what do bats do for us? I think many of us understand this. Bats give us this ecosystem service where they eat pests. They're busy consuming pest species, and they pollinate for us. And so this loss of over 1 million bats has really been estimated to cost $3.7 to $53 billion a year to agriculture. That free service that the bats had because of this new pathogen that has decreased our populations, now we have to deal with the pest species that are no longer being consumed. And I also just want to point out, we do have this national plan that was developed in May, and Ken Salazar there, his statement, but since May, it's now gone to 19 states. So white nose syndrome is spreading in the United States. And then lastly, to kind of beat this into us, giving 3 examples, I want to give the last one and to kind of bring this interrelatedness together, and that's looking at Toxoplasma Gondii, which is a parasitic agent that many of us in this room are probably familiar with because it's really a problem, particularly for women when they get pregnant. And if you're exposed when you're pregnant, it can be a very bad thing for the fetus. But Toxoplasma, the only definitive host of this, are felid species, are cats. So they're the only species that can poop out the egg, the oocyst, and then other species can become infected from the egg, the Toxoplasma egg. But one thing that has been noted in the last decade or so is that this Toxoplasma Gondii, these eggs, this parasitic egg, can last up to 6 months in water. So it can last a really long time and then infect other species. And this has been a hugely significant problem in California with the California sea otters. And there's been some great studies showing that flushing kitty poop in our toilets and getting it into the river systems, and then they go out into the estuary, the ocean area where the sea otters are, the sea otters get contaminated with it. So we can see again that sort of, it's all related, our keeping of domestic animals and then the contact with wildlife. So hopefully those 3 examples, and we'll come back to them at the end of the talk, but kind of for those of you who were non-believers at the beginning of this lecture, really see this relationship, this interrelated nature of the disease issues that we deal with in wildlife and humans with an ecosystem component. So for the second part of the talk, I really want to talk about conservation medicine in practice. And I'm going to focus on what we here at the zoo have kind of come up with, what we see the role of zoos in conservation medicine. And I'm going to read this slide just quickly, just so we all hear it. And these roles are studies of diseases of conservation concern, healthcare for the sustainability of biodiversity, zoo animals as sentinels of disease in urban and rural environments, comparative medicine, disease surveillance at the interface of wildlife, domestic animals, and humans, and the exploration of the diversity of life at the micro and macro levels. And what I'm going to do is kind of give little examples of each of these, and everything I'm about to show for the next few slides are projects that are done by zoos. So these are zoological facilities that are engaged in conservation medicine practice. And I've kind of divided it. I'm not going to go through all 6. I've kind of put together some of them because I think they work well together. So first we're going to talk about studies to look at diseases of conservation concern, and then the health care of for the sustainability of biodiversity. And zoos do a lot of clinical medicine as well as research to try to better understand some of these diseases that have a significant impact both on collection animals and free-living animals. So zoos are putting in the energy to better understand these. I mentioned chytridiomycosis in amphibians that has actually led to some extinction of some species. Zoos are working on better understanding this particular pathogen. So there's a number I list there, and there's a lot more, but just to give an example. But also zoos are really engaged in some of the health issues of conservation concern, and I give 2 examples here from work I've been fortunate to be involved in as a zoo vet, basically. And one is to work with wildlife that interacts with humans, in this case a bull elephant that, I don't know if you can see it very well, but he has a snare around his leg right here. And we actually spent a week trying to chase this guy to get the snare off, because if you leave that on, he could get osteomyelitis or bone infection, and he could die. And this bull is one of the most beautiful forest elephant bulls in this particular area, and this is from a few years ago. So it's possible that he has sired many individuals since then. And then working with orphaned wildlife. A lot of zoo vets are involved with giving health care to some of these orphans that may be orphaned because of the bushmeat trade, or because of, in this case, this elephant's mother was killed because of crop raiding and interactions with the village. But I think, when I say zoos are involved in healthcare for the sustainability of biodiversity, some of you may say, well, what does that have to do with conservation medicine? And I think, when we look at biodiversity and its importance, I've listed a few things here. I think for humans, it's important that we live on a biodiverse planet, and nature is very important. It's spiritually important, psychologically, emotionally, and from a public health standpoint. And I would argue those first three are sort of public health related, but we're going to talk a bit more about biodiversity and public health at more of a disease relationship. But I think, I really wanted to show these two pictures first because I think this is one of the cutest creatures on the planet. But really, if you look at, this is my son Charlie from a few years ago. And if you look at the expression on this little kid, and he's holding a sea turtle there that he's actually helping to release because it was going the wrong way from a beach. But you can see just the joy on this kid's face. And I will tell you, 20 minutes before this, he was whining because he was out on that beach late at night until we came across, a group of hatching sea turtles. And just the being in touch with nature was so intense. And then this orphaned elephant, and you can see both Germaine, our nanny, and Charlie, and even Koto, the elephant. Everyone is just excited about, sharing time together. I think it's really important that we have this relationship with biodiversity. But I'm gonna focus a little more scientifically and talk about, why else is biodiversity important from sort of a conservation medicine framework. And I'm just going to briefly touch on this what I think is a very important concept, and that's what's called the dilution effect. And we're going to use the disease Lyme disease, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. We deal with it here in the US. So if you look at, this is it's a tick-borne disease, so the bacteria pathogen gets into a tick that then can infect you if the tick gets on you and spreads the bacteria. And it's carried by rodents that you can see right here. So if in this woodland we have all these different species there, and then the larvae tick that feeds on the different species, and only the rodents can get the ticks infectious, you can see 3 red ones there. So if you walk through this woodland, you and your dog, the chance of you getting an infected tick on you is not so high, right? There's only 3 of them there. But if that same woodland has many of those species fall out, it's not quite so biodiverse. So we've lost many of those other species that don't carry the Lyme pathogen, and now we have more rodents there. If the same ticks feed on this group, you can see a lot more red ones. So if you and your dog walk through this area, the chance of you becoming infected is a lot higher. And that's one of the sort of public health preventive measures that I really think is important to understand with having sort of biodiversity there to prevent some of the emerging infectious diseases in humans. So secondly, zoos also are very important using the animals as sentinels for human health and comparative medicine. And I'll give you a few examples of that. The best example, I think, is when West Nile virus arrived in North America in 1999. I actually was a veterinarian at the Bronx Zoo at the time, and crows and people were dying of this new virus that had arrived in the US, right? And birds at our zoos were also dying. And it was really this ability to understand what known viruses in the US can infect and kill some of those bird species, that it was figured out that this is a novel new virus that had arrived in the US. And it was really the first isolate of West Nile virus was from one of these zoo birds that had died. So really the zoo served as a sentinel for this very important emerging disease for animals and humans here in the US. And really, we in the zoo business, a lot of our populations are kind of a pan population, and we do a lot of surveillance for some of these, these issues, these emerging diseases like West Nile virus, avian influenza, rabies, cancer and toxins. And we can use our zoo collections to kind of understand some of these diseases that are important for our zoo animals, for domestic animals, and for us. So they're very good sentinels. But also, you know, as I'm saying tonight, zoos do a lot outside of zoo walls. A lot of our conservation work is not just with our collection animals, it's also with free-living animals. And one example I'm going to use here as sentinels is sea turtle work that I've been very fortunate to be involved with over a number of years with zoos. And part of this was really looking at sea turtles that many people think of sort of as sentinels of ocean health. They swim through our oceans, they have to come to the beaches to lay their eggs, and really they can give us kind of an indicator of ocean health. So when I started this project 10 years or so ago, we really were looking at sort of just some basic health data on different populations, but you know, I have toxins there to understand toxins that the sea turtles may have been exposed to understand ocean health as well as sea turtle health. But one of my sites actually was in Gabon, Central Africa there, and it's one of the best places in the world for leatherback nesting. So that was one of my field sites, which was actually wonderful. And this is those hatching sea turtles from that picture I just showed you of that young boy with a sea turtle. But during our study, what we found actually kind of blew me away. You know, I was really thinking about toxins and ocean health. And so here we are in you know, deepest, darkest Africa, Central Africa, and what we discovered was that light pollution was a huge problem for these sea turtles. So if there's anything you need to know about sea turtles, they love light. And so when they hatch, the moon over the ocean is kind of their signal to go run to the water. When the females lay their eggs and they're done laying their eggs, their signal to go back to the ocean is sort of the moon and the light on the ocean. So if we have artificial light on land, it misdirects the way sea turtles go, and so they will go towards the light. So here we are in you know, Central Africa, and we found, you can't really see here, but the beach is there. And what we found, this is a female leatherback about half a mile into the savanna. And during one of our field seasons, this is December 2006 to 2007, we recorded 71 of these female leatherbacks that had walked out into the savanna. So light pollution was really increasing, and what you can't see on this slide out this way is this new tourist resort at one of the best nesting beaches in the world in Central Africa. So it gave us an indicator of sort of changing ecosystem health, and light pollution can affect many species. So just an example of using a turtle as a sentinel of ocean health, and it kind of showed us we had some health issues on the beach there. And then thirdly, looking at disease surveillance at the interface of wildlife, domestic animals, and humans. And one of the studies I've been very fortunate to be involved in was working with maned wolves and domestic dogs in Bolivia, so a maned wolf here. And as many of you know, closely related, so wild carnivores and domestic carnivores share a lot of diseases. So in this study was trying to understand what diseases these two animals, this is in one of the villages here, a colleague of mine, Ellen Bronson, Bleeding the Dog, and testing for diseases in these two different populations to kind of understand, are we having some conservation risk for the maned wolves because of the dogs that are encroaching on this national park? But kind of a byproduct of this study is a lot of education that we were doing in the villages. We have it in Spanish and English, but to vaccinate for life. So to get a vaccine campaign of rabies, which can spread from domestic dogs to maned wolves, but as you all know, can also spread to people. So we're doing it as the conservationists, vaccinate your dogs to protect our maned wolves, but it's also going to protect your children. So sort of that interface, the disease surveillance at the interface. And also a lot of zoo projects, and this is one from the Galapagos where I was, one of our colleagues, Dr. Marilyn Cruz, and sampling a duck here as part of an avian influenza surveillance. So a lot of the studies that zoo personnel are doing are part of this sort of surveillance, pandemic prediction and prevention for surveillance of diseases that have human health impacts. And then the last role that we really see is sort of this exploration of the diversity of life. And zoos have been, over the years, really instrumental with a lot of our field work with discovering at the macro level, discovering new vertebrate species. I think in the last 5 years or so, 2 new rodent species in Indonesia. I mean, we're still finding vertebrate species. But also, I think more exciting and something that's been moving forward is what we call microbiome. So really discovering at the microscopic level the full suite of all the creatures that are on all of us. And this is really a big thing in human medicine now, but it also, when we think about our collections, both in zoos as well as animals we work with free living, the ability to understand the diversity within all these species. And this paper actually is from Science, the Science Journal, the evidence of evolution of mammals and their guts. And one of our curators, Steve Bircher, who's a curator of carnivores, is a co-author on this paper. And it was looking at samples from 56 of our animals here at the zoo. And not that I understand this picture at all, but what it's saying is that they discovered just basically new microbes by looking at these new taxa. So it's discovering more life. And one of the projects that we've started this year actually was a couple weeks ago would have been in the surveillance category, and that's a project where we're looking at the health status of camels in Kenya. And camels have become a really important climate adaptive species in Kenya. The ecosystem just doesn't hold cattle as well as it used to. So the number of camels have really increased, and people drink the milk. And we estimate about 4 million people drink unpasteurized camel milk. And so there's a lot of those zoonotic pathogens, those pathogens that can be spread through camel milk to people, but they also share a lot of diseases with the wildlife where they live. So if I gave this talk a month ago, I would have said, well, this is one of our surveillance projects that we have, looking at the health of these 3 groups. But just this week, it actually moved over to the microbiome level, and that's because we're working now with WashU folks in their viral discovery laboratory, and we're gonna try to do pathogen discovery, so to understand non-discovered microbes that may be in the camel population there that may have pandemic potential in the future. So it's kind of a surveillance project that's moving more into the discovery of life at the micro level. And then lastly, I didn't have it as the 6 roles, but I think one thing that a lot of people that aren't sort of in this zoo world are amazed with, we in the US, we have 213 AZA, or Association of Zoos and Aquariums, accredited zoos. And that means we have to live up to many, many standards. And some of those standards are we have to do great education, and we have to do research and conservation. And we, at these zoos, we have 175 million annual visitors. And that's more than all these crazy football and soccer people and all the big sports. So we really have a big audience. And I think from the conservation standpoint, I think that really is, we're good at getting the conservation message out, and I think it's a real opportunity to get out the conservation medicine message also, and this understanding of this interconnected One Health. So that's another role that we play that I didn't have listed, but education, education, education. So the last part of my talk, I'm really going to focus in on the St. Louis Zoo and talk sort of about where we've been and where we're going. And really, you know, I said conservation medicine started about 20 years ago, and the St. Louis Zoo has been a leader in conservation medicine for over 20 years. You know, we provide excellent health care for collection animals, and I think this must have been a dental exam and a very happy helper here. But, you know, we have a full-time pathologist, Dr. Mary Duncan. We have a really excellent staff across the board with many different health specialties. We also have, for many, many years, done health studies of populations in the wild. And in 2004, as many of you know, the Wildcare Institute was started at the zoo. And then this year, we've launched this new Institute for Conservation Medicine. And you can really see, you know, this has been a long-term effort by the zoo and our role in conservation medicine. So just briefly, you know, the Wildcare Institute, which was started in 2004, and the original 12 centers here, and it's really about doing conservation in many different sites around the globe. And many of these also have a medical component. And I'm just going to briefly talk about the center that I was very fortunate to work for 3 years, and that's this Wildcare Institute Center for Avian Health in Galapagos. And it's a consortium of the zoo, the University of Missouri in St. Louis, the Charles Darwin Foundation, and the Galapagos National Park. But it's also a consortium of many different disciplines. All these different players are part of the team. And the directors of this center are Dr. Patty Parker and Dr. Eric Miller. And this paper from 2006, so 5 years ago now, is, you know, conservation medicine on the Galapagos Islands. This has been going on for a while. And this is the group that I was very fortunate to join a year or two after this paper as one of the conservation medicine players. So just one example of one of our Wildcare centers. But this year, we've launched this new Institute for Conservation Medicine. And in yellow here we have, these are the disciplines that we have here at the zoo that I think are really part of a conservation medicine team. And we have a lot of these players here at the zoo. But you know, we're not medical doctors, and we're not climatologists or water quality specialists. You know, we're not ecosystem health practitioners. So really a lot of what I've been doing this first year, getting the Institute up and running, is building these partnerships and collaborations with other disciplines that the zoo really wants to play with. We have a lot to offer, but we really, to tackle some of these challenges we've talked about, we need these partnerships. So our mission statement is the St. Louis Zoo Institute for Conservation Medicine takes a holistic approach to research on wildlife, public health, and sustainable ecosystems to ensure healthy animals, healthy people. And what I'd like to do for the last slides is end on really positive notes, because I know a lot of this is heavy, you know, we have some challenges that face us today, but I'm going to go back to those 3 examples I showed you at the beginning and show you what comes out of some of this research that we're doing. So, you know, the story about the vultures, right? So 90% decline in these 3 populations, these 3 species. Well, now in India, diclofenac is illegal, so they no longer have it on the market. That's a really good thing that came out of these studies. Additionally, they have vulture restaurants. So they have places where they're feeding vultures uncontaminated meat to help with the population. You know, they're doing captive breeding and other things, but these are solutions to some of these heavy problems that we're talking about. That's a good thing. So, you know, white nose syndrome I mentioned. In May 2011, there's a national management plan, and some of those things, some caves are closed so we don't spread this pathogen. Caves that are open, they have preventive measures to try not to spread this fungus. Lots of research efforts are going in to better understand this disease. And there's some captive breeding colonies for some of the 3 of the species that are really low and getting at the, you know, worried about extinction level. We've got some captive breeding going on. These are solutions. These are good things. This is what comes out of conservation medicine. So I mentioned about the poop and the kitties, right? Well, you know, some of the things, and I love this. This is a tweet that Julie Lay came up with. Be number one with your cat's number two. Trash it, don't flush it. I mean, I think that's a great little tweet that somebody just is trying to get those messages across about things that each of us can do to try to minimize some of these negative impacts that we might have. That's preventive medicine to me. So kind of to wrap it up, and hopefully I've generated some discussion points, but really conservation medicine is kind of looking at, planet as patient and this interrelatedness of humans, animals, and ecosystems. And our byline with the Institute for Conservation Medicine really is, healthy animals, healthy people. And hopefully, with the 40 minutes I've talked, that you really see that relationship. If you didn't see it before you came in, you really understand it now. Yes, and I think I'll stop there, and thank you very much. So I don't know if anyone has any, there's one right behind you, and then, yep.
A couple of diseases that pretty much come under control today are smallpox and polio. Are those two zoonotic diseases?
That's a great question. I don't think polio is under control today. But they are zoonotic. Smallpox and rinderpest are the only two diseases I know that have been eradicated. But polio, we still, and there's been some good studies that have shown the relationship with chimps and humans with polio outbreaks. Yep. Yeah, that's a great question. So white nose syndrome, the fungus is called Geomycin destructans, and that's because it destroys tissue. But really, its native home is Europe, and bats in Europe are not dying of it. They've evolved with it. So kind of the working theory right now is in 2006, somehow it arrived in the U.S., and chances are it arrives on one of us, with travel and movement. And then our bats, as many of you know, if you've never been exposed to something, you don't have the immune system to fight it. So they're a naive population that's just been hit with a really pathogenic agent. So nobody knows exactly the day it arrived or how it arrived, but it came from Europe. And there's some really good studies right now doing genotyping of the pathogen in Europe and here in the U.S. Okay. Yeah, that's a good question, and with the FIV and hopefully if any other veterinarians are in the audience, they can catch me on this. But there are semi-species specific, because we see those viruses in other cat species, not just domestic cats, and some like we have the Puma strain of FIV, and so they're not totally species specific, but they're feline specific, let's say. But when we think of like FIV, feline immunodeficiency virus, HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, SIV, simian immunodeficiency virus, there's a lot of relationships there, and there's a lot of possibility for mutations that can occur. I think that answers it. Yes? but how's it funded? That's a great question. For one thing I should say, you know, we're a tax-based zoo, and to run the zoo is taxes help that. This institute is nothing to do with taxes. It's all private donations, it's grants we're writing, so it's all moving forward with generating the funds from donors who are interested in it, as well as the proposals that I'm writing daily. So, yeah. So if anyone wants to help in that area, you're more than welcome. Yeah, right. Yeah.
What you described, it seems to me from the avian flu where it came around 2000, crows just seem to disappear in blue jays. I see crows now, not in the numbers I used to, and I see blue jays. Does that mean the populations are large enough that they eventually develop an immunity?
Yeah, and I think you're talking about West Nile virus, right? Yeah, so West Nile virus. And yeah, so some of these populations are rebounding back. And part of that is because, you know, we talked a little bit about immunity. So if you're naive to an agent, many of the population will die because they just don't have the immunity to fight it off. But some will survive and they may bounce back. And so that's a good thing, because the ones who bounce back are usually the ones that are resistant to a pathogen. But one of the things when we think about the Anthropocene and sort of all these sort of what I call the whammies that are hitting populations, so now you're kind of been lowered down, but the crows are coming back, but there's other stressors that may be out there as well. So new competitive other bird species potentially, or changes to their habitat. And so those numbers can't bounce back. The resilience isn't in the system as much as it may have been before many of the changes we're seeing. So, but yeah, the crows, some of these species are bouncing back. Some aren't bouncing back as well as others. Yeah, and I think one of the other things when it comes to songbirds is, you know, these whammies I'm talking about. So West Nile was one of them, but feral cats. There's so many pesticides. There's so many possible what am I trying to say? So yeah, there's so many threats that are hitting them that it's hard to tease out exactly which one it is. And when something like West Nile arrives, you can say, okay, it's West Nile because we're testing them and so forth. But then the levels just aren't what they quite used to be. You can say, well, why is that? And there's a lot of possibilities. There's a lot of confounders. See, once I give a talk, I can't think afterwards because it's past my bedtime. But yes. Yeah, a lot of that is true, and there's actually it was our group. It was Patricia Parker and her grad students at UMSL that were instrumental in detecting that Plasmodium has been found in the penguins, and Plasmodium is a type of malaria, so avian malaria. Is Plasmodium, but there's all different Plasmodium species. And now kind of doing the epidemiology is trying to figure out really, is this a pathogenic Plasmodium or a not so pathogenic one? And so that's kind of the detective work that's going on now, because we really don't know if it's causing population declines in the penguins or not. We do know it's present, and from some archived work from about 10 or 15 years ago, with just 100 penguins, it wasn't present. So is it a new arrival? Could be. But a lot of exciting research is going on with that right now. Yep.
I think the work that's been done with hellbenders is a very local thing, and here you are with some live, brand new hellbenders.
Yeah. You know, shame on me, I didn't have one. No, I did have a hellbender picture. Oh, there he is, yeah, okay. No, you're right, and you know, the zoo, one of the Wildcare centers is the Hellbender Center, and we've done some amazing stuff with Hellbenders, and I don't know if any of our reptile curators are here, but and what he's referring to is basically for the first time, we at the zoo have bred Hellbenders in captivity, eggs have hatched, and we have living baby hellbenders, and that's just incredible. One thing I will say in terms of the Institute for Conservation Medicine, we've talked a lot with the curators and with Jeff Brigler, who's a herpetologist here in the state, about looking at some of these water quality and hellbender health studies to better understand the decline right here in Missouri. So that is one of our projects that we really are moving forward on. So. Yeah, but I'm glad I have a hellbender picture. I need a baby hellbender next time. There's one, I think, in the back, maybe. Yep. Did you say, how do I see it, or? Oh. Yeah. Good question. The first thing we're doing, so I've gone around to a lot of universities and the med schools and the botanical garden. I've really reached out to a lot of people to kind of talk about this movement, conservation medicine and One Health. And in March, we're going to have a workshop that is bringing together a lot of these people who have said they really do want to collaborate. They really are interested. I think, you know, part of that can be the education quality, the education component. And we work, you know, with our education department here, who's really excited about conservation medicine. So if some of those collaborators are part of it is education, I think that's fantastic. But right now, it's really been at the university level. I will say another project that I haven't talked about that we're doing is sort of looking at box turtle health and ecology. And part of that is getting elementary school kids engaged and out chasing box turtles. So getting them connected with nature and kind of dealing with this nature deficit disorder that we have in kids today. So that's part of the education component. So that's, you know, looking at ecosystem health, turtle health, and getting our little kids, you know, healthy. So that's a good example. I don't know if I really answered your question, but I think education's the key to kind of dealing with many of these problems and trying to come up with solutions. I think we did it. Okay, thank you very much for coming in. I'm around for a few minutes if you want to talk. Thanks.